others have done.
From bureaus worldwide, this is FSN.
It is a Brexit bribe, you lying old bastard, you. How you doing? Welcome to Monday's Richie Allen Show. Coming up for 3 minutes past the hour. I am Richie Allen. It's March 4th, 2019. Got a terrific show lined up for you today. Let's do it.
Welcome back to the most listened to independent radio show in Europe. It's your Richie Allen Show.
It really is, you know. Really is. Right, you can tweet at Richie Allen Show right now.
It's the Richie Allen Show. Broadcasting live on richieallen.co.uk and multiple platforms around the world. And now, here's your host, Richie Allen.
Yes, I'm looking forward to speaking again with the author and broadcaster Mark Collett. Mark joins me in the second hour. We will talk about the last couple of years, the increase in knife crimes and murders in the UK. We'll also talk about Brexit, we'll talk about free speech, we'll talk about a lot of things with Mark in the second hour of the programme. Before that, an old friend of mine, been speaking to him for many years now, the terrific Stephen Lendman joins me live from Chicago. That's this hour where we'll be talking about, well, we'll be asking the question, is military intervention by the United States of America imminent in Venezuela? We'll do that with Stephen Lendman this hour. As usual, before that, we'll round up 2 or 3 of the biggest stories of the day. Live on Fab Radio 2 here in Manchester, triggerwarning.tv, my own website, TuneIn Radio, and many other places as well. Yes! How you doing? You well? March of many weathers. Do you remember that? Do you remember your parents describing March as many weathers? Well, we've had it all today in Manchester. We've had it all. Gale force winds overnight into this morning. This morning. Then torrential rain. Then sunshine and calm. And then torrential rain again. 'Tis mad. But it's good. It's good. It's not cold. It's good. Cliche day. March of many weathers. Cliche day. We're going to start off with a laugh because it's Monday. Monday. La, 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 la. Do you want a good laugh? I bet you missed this today. You see, I like Victoria Derbyshire. I've always liked her. I think she's a very, very good presenter. Even though she's on the BBC. She's very good, very charismatic presenter, Victoria. And today she spoke with a couple of women who are so scared of climate change, they're not going to have children. Yes, so scared of climate change, they've decided not to have any children. Blythe Pepino and Alice Brown say they are so scared about the future of the planet they can't bring themselves in good conscience to have children. They are part of a group called Birth Strike. Get it? Going on strike, not having children, Birth Strike. And they spoke to Victoria Derbyshire. To save the planet, we're having no babies.
What kind of fuckery is this?
Hey, it's fuckery, Amy. It's properly fuckery. Here's Blythe Pepino. What a name. Blythe. With a name like that, you shouldn't have any children. Blythe Pepino.
Our planet is in a kind of collapse. The natural world is collapsing around us, and that's actually happening right now.
Can't argue with that. A lot of things happening. Why though?
Now. And I'm so disappointed by the response by our authorities to this crisis, and so freaked out by it. Everything that I've read, that I've basically last year I came to the decision that I couldn't bring a child into that.
No babies.
And I was asking around people that I know, put it a little bit out on Facebook, and realised actually quite a lot of other people are making this decision. And so we realised it was really, really important to tell the public that there are people out there that are so scared about this that they feel that they can't actually have a family.
Wow, they're playing a game of one-upmanship with primary school children who went on strike. Do you remember this? A couple of weeks ago when I was sick, primary school children went on strike over climate change. And the mothers are like, well, we'll see about that. Well, the non-mothers are like, well, we'll see about that. We're not going to have any babies. Blythe Pepino. Well, if you think Blythe Pepino, what a name. If you think she's well and truly fucked, Wait till you hear her friend Alice Brown. Alice can barely get out of bed in the morning. She's so depressed at climate change. She's on birth strike too.
I mean, each day for me is a struggle. I really do. I'm so depressed. I feel so hopeless over how, I'm reading just in the last couple of months even that, insect numbers are plummeting so fast.
They are. Insect numbers are definitely plummeting fast, and bee colonies are collapsing for sure.
It now threatens the collapse of nature, that we're losing biodiversity. We're not losing, we're destroying biodiversity so quickly that threatens our food. And the UN have said that could lead to the risk of our own extinction. David Attenborough going on TV.
Oh, well, if David Attenborough said it.
On TV to say the collapse of civilization could come from this. And I know that is so hard to really sit with and take in. But I have done that, and that has led to just a fear that I've never felt before. And my decision for being on birth strike mostly has come from not wanting to pass that fear on to someone else if we're in this situation now.
Ah, Alice.
What kind of fuckery are you?
Heard it all now. Bee colonies, insect colonies, certainly in decline and in collapse. But is it because of man's industrial activity on planet Earth? No. Certainly the oceans are in serious trouble because of the amount of pollution in them. There's no doubt about that. But are we changing the climate? No, there's no evidence of that whatsoever. How screwed up do you have to be? How impressionable do you have to be to come to the conclusion we're not going to have any babies? Why? Because of climate change, I tells you. Absolutely, man. Thought that might cheer you up this Monday. Here's a very big story. Let's get serious. Getting lost in among the knife crime story and the Brexit story. But it's still very big. We will talk knife crime and a little bit of Brexit later on in the show. But this is a very big story. Here's Sky News' Adam Bolton.
The Westminster strand of the independent inquiry into child sexual abuse opens this morning. Public hearings into allegations of exploitation involving public figures associated with Westminster will take place over the next 3 weeks. Well, Sky's home editor Jason Farrell is at the inquiry in central London, and many of the most lurid allegations have already been disproved. So what are they going to be looking at?
Disproved, Adam? Really? That's news to me, pal. Of course, you, Adam Bolton, haven't covered politics since the year dot in Westminster. You better hope it all gets disproved, Adam, lest we all start to ask you and all the other hacks who've been around since the year dot, who saw nothing either. What were you doing when it was going on? Were you scratching your rectum, boy? Were you while all of this was going on? Because it hasn't been disproved. Anyway, to Adam's intrepid reporter, Jason Farrell.
We've just started to hear from Brian Altman, who is the Queen's Counsel in this inquiry, and he is addressing the inquiry as we speak. He says they're going to be looking at things such as whether there were attempts to cover up allegations, whether the Westminster establishment sought to influence police, whether there was a culture of shielding people of public prominence. Now, we know this inquiry was set up in 2014 to look at all forms of children and whether they were properly protected within institutions, whether that be the church, whether that be children's care institutions, whether that be within Westminster. And we know that this is potentially the most controversial element of it because we're talking about high-profile figures. Their names have been mentioned before, allegations against Leon Britton, the former Home Secretary, allegations against Edward Heath and Lord Janner as well, the former Labour peer.
Yeah, Lord Janner, we'll come to him in a minute. We're very interested in all of this, of course. Just to repeat what Farrell said, the independent inquiry into child sex abuse was set up in 2014 after the Savile scandal broke and all the rumours about a Westminster paedophile ring, okay? That's what's happened. Alexis Jay is the current chair of it. Never forget, as long as you live, that Theresa May, the current UK Prime Minister, should be in prison for 20 years for trying to pervert the course of justice. Because when she was Home Secretary, Theresa May appointed two people, Fiona Woolf and Elizabeth Butler Sloss, successively, two people with intimate knowledge of and whom had relationships with men whom were accused of abuse like Leon Britton. May basically tried to cover it up. She really did. It isn't conjecture. She should have been arrested. She should have been thrown out of the Conservative Party, and she should be in prison. No two ways about it. Now, Greville Janner, Lord Janner, who died in very mysterious circumstances back in December of 2015. I say mysterious because he'd been ruled unfit to stand trial for sex offences committed historically against children. He'd been ruled unfit, importantly, to stand trial because he had dementia. But here's the kicker. Months after he was ruled unfit to testify, months after it was ruled that he didn't have testamentary capacity, he was actually driving himself to the House of Lords. And the press, apart from the Daily Mail, went to great lengths to keep that secret. Months after we were told he was a quivering mass of jelly, incapable of recognising himself in the mirror, he was driving himself to Westminster to the House of Lords, collecting his £300 a day and snoring and farting his way through the afternoons. He was compos mentis, he was driving himself, and then he died suddenly. Here's Daniel Janner, his son, QC, and he's still crying about this inquiry, saying that it's a disgrace that his old man is being mentioned and that these hearings are taking place.
This is another sad chapter in this beleaguered inquiry, because what is happening here, and let there be no mistake about this is a trashing of good people, people who were never convicted of offences such as my late father, Lord Britton, as you say, and Edward Heath. It's based on tittle-tattle, it's based on rumour, and this whole thing should be shut down. It's a disgrace.
What a load of bollocks. Let's not forget that Wiltshire Police and Mike Veal exhaustively investigated the claims made against former Prime Minister Edward Heath and concluded in their report, Operation Conifer, I think it was called, that if Edward Heath were alive today, he would be charged. You see, Greville Janner, who's dead now, with the Jewish Labour peer, his fondness for young boys was an open secret at Westminster for decades. This is true. Dozens, and young girls as well, dozens of men and women came forward to make claims against him in the last 10 to 15 years. In Leicester, he regularly visited children's homes there. He took boys out of those homes. This is true, it's not conjecture. And he took them to local hotels. This is all true. And back in 1991, after an allegation had been made against Janner, talk about the cover-up now, Leicestershire police couldn't even be bothered their arses to check with the hotels that one victim said he'd been taken to. So one poor lad said, well, he took me to this hotel. And Leicestershire police didn't even seek to look at the records for the hotel. Incompetence, or was that a cover-up? I wrote about this in an article on richieallen.co.uk over a year ago. Janner, in my opinion, avoided prosecution for serious sexual abuse of children because he was being protected. There's no two ways about it. And I want you to remember this. Very important. Back in 2014, a year before Janner died, the Crown Prosecution Service here in the UK weighed up all the evidence against Greville Janner and then charged him with 22 counts of child abuse. So certain were they would secure a conviction. Then Janner was diagnosed with dementia, conveniently. We were told he couldn't testify, but for months after that, the old boy was driving himself to Westminster, snoring and farting and burping his way through the afternoons and collecting £300. He was unaccompanied. Right? Think of Junior Soprano. How could he be unaccompanied if there was nothing wrong with him? He was a filthy abuser of young boys and young girls, whatever his son says. Not, as I said last year, is that I have a heart of stone. Must be tough for people when they learn that their father or their brother or sister abused children. It's not nice. But Daniel Janner should piss off into obscurity and let justice take its natural course, in my opinion. Now, we will talk knife crime in the second hour of the programme with Mark Collett. There have been calls for a knife crime SAR to be appointed to get a grip on the rise in youth violence. Lord Hogan Howe, a former commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, he's been calling for this knife crime SAR. There has been a 93% rise in the number of under 16 stabbed in the last 5 years. This weekend, terrible incidents in London and Greater Manchester. 2 17-year-olds, a girl and a boy, were murdered, and it's been all over the news today. UK Prime Minister Theresa May has said that she recognised people's concerns, but she says there's no correlation between the rise in knife crime and a decline in police numbers. Really? Here's Theresa May.
If you look at the figures, what you see is that there's no direct correlation between certain crimes and police numbers. What matters is how we ensure that the police are responding to these criminal acts when they take place, that people are brought to justice. But what also matters is, as a government, that we look at the issues that underpin, that underlie this use of knives, and that we act on those. That's a cross-government approach. It's not just about the police, it's about the whole of government, and it's the whole of government that is responding.
It's an absolute nonsense to say that a decline in police numbers doesn't play some part in it. And I want to talk about that with Mark Collett later on, because back in August of last year, a former equality commissioner, I think he was an equality commissioner, I know he's an equality campaigner, Trevor Phillips. Trevor Phillips wrote in the Sun newspaper back in August of last year, and he said that the media tiptoes around this issue. And I'll quote from Phillips, if you just give me a second there. I've got it there. Let's see. Let's scroll down. Yeah, Trevor Phillips, equality campaigner, speaking about London specifically and knife crimes in London and gang violence in London. He said in August of last year, he wrote in the Sun, I didn't see this because I don't read the Sun, it was given to me today. He wrote even, the media scrupulously avoids mentioning ethnicity. I understand the fear of stigmatising these groups, but nothing could be more relevant. He says ethnicity is really relevant. Race is part of the picture. Failing to point it out impedes the fight against these crimes and imperils yet more children of colour, he said. And Cressida Dick, who is the Metropolitan Police boss, said that much of the apparently random violence isn't random at all. It's the consequences of the war to supply middle-class people with drugs. We'll get into this in the second hour, as I said, with Mark Collett. Before that, though, we're live to Chicago to speak to Stephen Lendman. I welcome your comments on that. You'll be listening to Stephen with great interest, no doubt. We're going to talk about Venezuela because that's getting more and more serious, and that is a very serious issue. Very little, in fact, you would say scant coverage of Venezuela on BBC, Sky or Channel 4 today. It's really only the peripheral news organisations like RT that are covering it. Here's some George Michael back with Stephen Lendman in a couple of minutes' time. All right. Welcome to the Richie Allen Show. Good to be with you. Music from George Michael on the Richie Allen Show for Monday, March 4th, 2019. Right, before we introduce and welcome Stephen back to the programme, the BBC is reporting in the last 25 minutes the TV footage has shown Venezuela's self-declared leader, Juan Guaido, arriving back in Caracas, where the BBC says he risks arrest. Now, we've been following this very closely, of course, as has our next guest, the wonderful Stephen Lendman. Just before we welcome Stephen, we heard from the Venezuelan vice president on yesterday's programme, Sunday View, saying that the country was taking all legal means necessary to have its funds overseas returned to the country. She was bullish, she was defiant in the face of comments coming from people like John Bolton, of course, the neocon hawk that finds himself in the Trump administration. The Trump, of course, appointed him, much to the bemusement of his ardent supporters, those who believed that when he said interventionism was coming to an end, that he really meant it. Many people getting in touch with this program really fear that some sort of military intervention by the United States is imminent in Venezuela. Well, our first guest needs very little introduction to you. He's a fantastic writer and broadcaster. You can read him daily at stephenlendman.org. That's stephenlendman.org. You know this. You can follow him on Twitter. It's at Activist Writer on Twitter, at Activist Writer. He's all over this story and many other stories as well. Let's welcome him back live from Chicago, our great friend, Stephen Lendman. Stephen, welcome back. How are you?
Okay. Thank you, Richie. It's great to be on with you. I just literally added to an article I wrote on Venezuela. I've written so many on this topic that Guaido is back in the country. And among the people there to greet him at the Caracas airport was the French ambassador, to his shame. What can I say?
That's outrageous. The French ambassador is in Caracas and greeted Guaido as some sort of returning hero, Stephen.
Yes, indeed. A traitor guilty of treason or sedition or both. He violated a Supreme Court ordered travel ban, so he's got that crime against him. I've been urging the Venezuelan government to stop fiddling while Rome burns and put this guy in handcuffs and stick him in prison. Well, I mean, treat him with respect according to the law, but arrest him, detain him, bring charges against him, and prosecute him, and let the law, let the facts speak for themselves. By the way, Richie, in an article I'll get out tomorrow, I compared John Bolton. I call him deranged and dangerous John Bolton. I compared him to the three maniacal characters in Stanley Kubrick's 1964 dark political satire, Dr. Strangelove, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb.
And I laugh, right? And I laugh because it's funny, but I shouldn't laugh because the man is a psychopath.
Oh, he is. He is. There's no question about it.
And is he?
I mean, there's literally something wrong with this guy, Richie.
Sorry to interrupt you, Stephen. In the Trump administration, is John Bolton the driving force? Is he the most vocal in terms of wanting to take very strong action in Venezuela? Not that there should be any action. Venezuela has never threatened the United States. Most of what we're hearing about Venezuela in the news is nonsense and is lies anyway. But is it Bolton that's pushing it the hardest?
I think it's a combination of Bolton and Pompeo, Richie. I think the two of them together, the Bobbsey twins. I mean, they're really alter egos. They're both deranged and maniacal. I mean, you can listen to what they say. What's coming out of the mouth of one could just as easily come out of the mouth of the other. And the only reason Pompeo has been off in Hanoi and I don't know where else, so he's been on the North Korea story. He'll get back to Washington and he'll be on the Venezuela story again. But this morning, Sunday, John Bolton tweeted hostile remarks about Venezuela and hostile remarks about Cuba. More sanctions on Cuba coming, Richie.
This is outrageous. Now, I'd like your help, Stephen. Many of our listeners, there isn't anything wrong with their intelligence, but they're reading the newspapers like we are. They're watching the news, and they don't understand exactly what has happened in Venezuela. Can you put some context here? Who is Juan Guaido and what's exactly happening? How has this guy suddenly popped up like a jack in the box to claim that he's the rightful heir to the throne in Venezuela? What's exactly happened and who is this guy, Stephen?
Well, as far as Guaido goes, Richie, he's a guy who's been trained by the U.S. I wrote about this in one of my articles, trained by the U.S. over the past 10 years. If you can imagine this, I think he went to college and what other training he got in the U.S. I think he spent some time in Europe, but he literally went through a training program to assume the role that he's undertaken now. And if he did it, I imagine there are other Venezuelans who've been put through the same training, so in case he gets bumped off, there's somebody else to bring to the fore to take his place, and other people like him in other countries as well. But the situation in Venezuela is really this. The country is a Bolivarian social democracy. It earmarks the majority of the country's revenues for social benefits, education, healthcare, affordable housing, treating its indigenous people responsibly, all kinds of things. Of course, the country is in very serious trouble because of the sanctions that Obama began and Trump intensified, and I call it sanctions war, and economic war besides that, just making the economy scream and making Venezuelans suffer. But the country is the leading, it's really the leading democracy in the world, but it certainly is the leading democracy in the Western Hemisphere. There's no comparison between Venezuela and America, a money control system that's no democracy at all, a fantasy democracy in the U.S., but Venezuelans have the real thing, and that's why the country has been earmarked for regime change. I think literally straight away, Richie, after Chavez's December 1998 election, beginning with the Clinton co-presidency, picked up by Bush Cheney, then Obama, and now Trump, and it's really going ferociously now. But Venezuela is a model country. It's the threat of a good example, the way the country should be run, and that's why the people in Washington want Maduro deposed.
Really interesting, and I want to talk to you in a couple of minutes about social democrat as opposed to socialism, because Americans, just like English people and Irish people, are not stupid at all, but they confuse social democracy with socialism. And they look at people like Bernie Sanders and Jeremy Corbyn and others, even Hillary Clinton, and they think they're socialists, but they're not. There's a huge difference. And I want to just touch on that. We might even disagree on that in a couple of minutes' time. But before we do that, you mentioned that Juan Guaido, I pronounce his name wrong all the time, that he was on a sort of a training program by the US. Is this documented, Stephen? Can we see this clearly?
I got this, I believe, from the Gray Zone, the Blumenthal Gray Zone site. He did a profile of Guaido. I don't think there are any public documents that anybody can get their hands on. I mean, this stuff goes on very secretly. Guaido and people like him that are literally picked out in countries where the U.S. Has a plot where they want to change the government and put in a puppet government suitable to serving U.S. interests. And there are many sovereign independent countries. We see all the nations that America has gone to war with, the active war zones now, but other countries that are earmarked for regime change, Iran, Nicaragua, Cuba. I'm certain there are fifth column elements in these countries that the U.S. wants to use to help create chaos and violence in the country. There's been a lot of chaos going on in Iran lately. It goes on, and it erupts every now and then it ebbs and it gets going again. But the same kind of thing is going on in Iran that's going on in Venezuela. It hasn't reached the same level in Iran as in Venezuela.
Not yet, you're right. And you know, Stephen, historically, you're absolutely right. I mean, if you look at the post-Mohammad Mossadegh era in Iran, the Shah was one of these trainees that you spoke about eloquently there. Stephen Lendman is our guest. It's stephenlendman.org. It might sound ass-kissy. I don't care. I love this man. This is a real journalist. There are very few of them left in the world. Go to stephenlendman.org. Articles there on the militarization of space for future wars, Ukraine. Brilliantly briefed and researched articles. Stephen, will what's happened in Syria give the US military-industrial complex and the neocons a moment of pause with respect to Venezuela? What do you think?
Oh, I don't think so, Richie. Look at Afghanistan. I remember an article I wrote years ago. I wrote a lot of articles on Afghanistan, but literally the first one I wrote, it might have been in 2007, somewhere around that time, so over 10 years ago. And my title, I forget the exact title, but the title was something like Venezuela, Another U.S. Lost War. I mean, the war was literally lost, maybe after a year. It began very strongly. The Taliban was routed. routed after the war began about 5 weeks after 9/11. The war planned months in advance. These wars just don't get launched spontaneously. At least 6 months planning went into that war. And my understanding was the Bush-Cheney people had a debate whether to go after Iraq first or Afghanistan, and they decided on Afghanistan. That was October 2001, and then January 2003 was the Iraq War. And March is usually the favorite month of going into war, but the 2003 was no, I'm wrong about that. That was, I think that was in March 2003. The Gulf War in 1991 was in January. And I remember where I was, Richie. I was still active in my former working life. I was at a hotel at an event I was involved with, and the news came over. And for me, I don't know what anybody else did, but it caught my attention and just froze me. I didn't want to hear anything more about what was going on with my business. I wanted to hear what was going on in Baghdad. And I got a little information. I didn't get too much, a little bit. And then later in the evening, I got more. But it was evening Baghdad time when the shock and awe bombing began. And then it was all over again in March 2003, Bush Cheney. What can I say?
Yeah.
Oh, well, your point about whether things going on in Syria, the way the war has not gone,
might make them think twice in terms of their approach to Venezuela. Because you write today, it might have been yesterday. No, it was today. A really interesting piece. Will Russia challenge the US regime change plot in Venezuela? And I don't know what the neocon hawks are thinking in DC, whether they think that Venezuela is too far away for Russia to somehow take the side of the Venezuelan government, whether it offers it military assistance. I mean, that would be incredibly serious if that were the case. What do you think? Will Russia challenge it? Will Russia give the US government a moment of pause and possibly make them think twice about it?
The reason I wrote the article, Richie, I've mentioned the same thing in other articles, is I'm literally conducting a campaign to get Russia to intervene actively, not rhetorically. The problem with Russia, as far as a lot of what it does, is it opposes things rhetorically, and rhetorical criticism falls on deaf ears in Washington. I use Syria as an example. Russia intervened in Syria to combat U.S.-supported terrorists, and I'm talking about ISIS, al-Nusra, which is an al-Qaeda offshoot in Syria. These groups were created and supported by the U.S., and this is an absolute fact. Well, Russia did that, and it certainly turned the tide of things, changed the dynamic on the ground in Syria. The war goes on. I don't see it ending anytime soon. It could go on for years longer, because even though the U.S. scheme was defeated, the U.S. will continue waging this battle because it still wants regime change in Syria and all the other sovereign independent countries. But I use that as an example for Russia to do something similar in Venezuela, not by sending warplanes over. My idea was for Russia to work jointly with China, with Xi Jinping in China, and send peacekeepers to Venezuela, a peacekeeping force to maintain the peace, but send a large enough force, both countries jointly, but if China won't do it, then Russia to do it on its own. And I don't know whether the Trump people would want to go into Venezuela militarily with Russian forces on the ground, because it would risk confrontation between both countries. My guess is it would give them pause not to do it. But what I think the Trump people have in mind, Richie, is this: not sending in the Marines, but waging a proxy war like the Contra Wars in the Contra War in the 1980s against Nicaragua, and similar wars against El Salvador and Guatemala. Yeah. This is what I think they have in mind. But my fear is that if they do this, and I think they will do it, if it fails, then they might send in the Marines.
Yeah, I it's an excellent answer to that. I don't see Putin reacting in the way that he reacted in terms of what was happening in Syria, purely because it was on his doorstep. In terms of Syria, he couldn't ignore it, and Venezuela is so far away. I also don't like the fact that Vladimir Putin meets so regularly with Benjamin Netanyahu on the record and off the record. I mean, that's a fact as well. I think we, in terms of I've spoken about it, I know you've written about it, we're the only people who want to talk about that. You know, Putin has done the right thing by Syria. Thank God he has. It's very important that Syria doesn't fall. But I don't like the influence that the Israeli government has or appears to have over Putin. Do you want to comment on that? Am I overstating that, Stephen, or are you worried about that too?
Oh, you're not overstating it at all, Richie. I feel exactly the way you do. I'm absolutely appalled that Putin and Netanyahu have had a number of meetings in Moscow. I don't think Putin has gone to Tel Aviv or any place in Israel, but Netanyahu shows up in Moscow a number of times. And I was particularly outraged when Putin, it was either, I think it was last May, when Putin invited Netanyahu to the commemoration of the end of World War II, the great patriotic war, where they have a big parade in Moscow and so on. And Putin honored Netanyahu by inviting him to that. I thought that was an absolute disgrace.
Yeah, and you know what's going on here in the UK with these anti-Semitism claims against the opposition Labour Party. Nobody wants to stand up to it. It's almost like McCarthyism here in the UK, which you lived through, my friend, and you know all about that. These are strange times. Nobody wants to speak about the Israeli influence geopolitically, not just in the affairs of the UK, but elsewhere as well. Stephen Lendman is our guest. It's stephenlendman.org. If you haven't been on the site before, bookmark it and go to it daily to read these articles. This is real independent journalism, brilliantly briefed, terrifically sourced information, and it's old school stuff. It really is. Socialism can't be allowed to thrive anywhere, Stephen. And I just wanted to ask you, it's my opinion, and I might very well be wrong, but it's my opinion that most people, again, not because I'm smarter than they are, I'm not smarter than anybody, but they don't understand socialism. They, listen to conservative talk shows and they start screaming about socialism when people like, people like Jeremy Corbyn, people like Bernie Sanders, I mentioned them earlier on, but these are social democrats. They're not socialists. Do you think that, it's a real shame that people don't understand what Salvador Allende was achieving in Chile, what Mossadegh did in Iran, what Chavez achieved, because what they did in those countries was they didn't take money out of the wealthy 10% or 15% of the population. They didn't do that. Real socialism is not about that. Does it absolutely, does it make you frustrated in some way that socialism is often misrepresented in the media, not just here but in America?
I think when people think of socialism theoretically or pure socialism maybe, that does not exist anywhere that I know of. Maybe the closest place where it would exist might be in a country like Cuba. But Cuba has free enterprise, and free enterprise is not socialist. The way it works in Venezuela is the main industry of the country, the oil industry, the PDVSA oil company, that is state operated. That's not socialism. I remember years ago under Chavez, when the economy was strong, when Venezuela had some of the strongest growth in South America, I remember a line I wrote saying the bankers in Caracas are having a party. And what I meant by that was they were making lots of money because the Venezuelan economy was so strong and they were profiting by it. And the same thing was true of other businesses, whether foreign investors investing in Venezuela or Venezuelan businesses. I mean, these are private enterprises operating in Venezuela. They were there before Chavez. They were there during Chavez. They're there now under Maduro. So to call Venezuela socialist, the only thing socialist about it is the ownership of PDVSA, the state oil company, and the fact that Venezuela uses the majority of its resources, its revenues, for social benefits. Well, I don't call that socialism. I call it treating all of the people in the country equitably. I mean, the rich in Venezuela don't need social benefits. They can take care of themselves very nicely. It's the ordinary Venezuelans that really need help, especially the poor. But what Chavez did, he took poverty in the country, and I forget the exact figures, but it was very high, maybe 7 70% when he was elected, and he took it down to maybe 7%. It was actually extraordinary. And even now, during the hottest of hard times, because of the sanctions war, there were all kinds of things being done for the Venezuelan people. There was subsidized food or free food. Medical care is able to give it to Venezuelan people. And there's no question that there's human suffering going on because of the sanctions, and oil revenues are way down, and oil prices are very low. Oil exports 3 or 4 years ago were, I think, maybe even as much as 4 million barrels a day. But I remember writing about 3 million barrels a day. Now it's about 1.2 million, hovering maybe even around 1 million barrels a day at lower prices. Oil prices not all that long ago were $100 a barrel or more. Now it's in the 50s.
That's right. That's right. And I want to mention, you talking about Chavez there. Chavez did not, as was reported in, and still is reported in Western media, tax the bejesus out of wealthy people in Venezuela. He did not. He gave them tax breaks, and he kept inflation low. And when people are keeping more of their money, they're spending more of their money in the economy. And Allende did this in Chile. Most people don't know this. I know you know, Stephen. When Salvador Allende nationalised Chilean copper, which was the absolute right and proper thing to do, and brought in all the social reforms he brought in, he actually gave tax breaks to first of all, he took about 40% of people out of taxation completely, and then he gave tax breaks to the top 5% earners in Chile. He didn't tax them. And when your conservative talk radio hosts and Fox News talk about socialism stealing from people who worked hard to earn their money to give to poor people, that is crap. It doesn't work like that in real socialism, and socialism is not incompatible with private enterprise thriving in the company as well. It's really important stuff, this. Stephen Lendman is our guest. Stephen, I want to talk about the weaponization of space for a minute, while we still have you for another 5 or 6 minutes. Before we do that, though, you've already answered the question, but I want to ask you again to reiterate it. You don't see American troops on the ground in Venezuela, but you do see the boosting of military groups or militant groups in a kind of a proxy way, as you described, a proxy situation. You see the United States maybe funneling arms and money and logistics to groups in the region that can then cause chaos in Venezuela.
Well, that's exactly right,
Yeah.
and that's another topic I wrote about. That internal elements in Venezuela supporting the government have one of their officials. Forget who it was. It might have been one of the Venezuelan envoys, but comments about the U.S. Maybe sending troops to neighboring Colombia, maybe mobilizing them in Central America. Puerto Rico was mentioned, and shipping arms to Central America, also shipping them out of Miami to Colombia, maybe Brazil as well, assault weapons and things related to that. So this is why I think the plot is, because Elliot Abrams is the one behind this, the convicted felon who orchestrated the Contra War back in the 1980s. I think he's orchestrating the same thing now to be unleashed against Venezuela. It hasn't happened yet, other than low-level intermittent violence in Caracas and other parts of the country. But I think this is leading up to something much more intense. And with U.S. weapons set in and U.S. proxies, whether they're people, a few deserters from the Venezuelan military, the most accurate number I saw was something like 100 most recently. A few days ago, the number I saw was 12. And then I saw a number of 100 that the members of the Venezuelan military were bribed with a promise by the Trump people of $20,000 for defecting. I say a promise. Who knows whether it would be fulfilled or not? And maybe 100 people took advantage of it and crossed the border into Colombia. Well, 100 people don't make a revolution. So I'm sure they were enlisting other people, anti-government elements, maybe Colombians, maybe Brazilians, maybe others in Central America, and they'll bring up a proxy force, a mercenary force, and they'll funnel them into Venezuela cross-border somehow. I mean, this is what they did in Nicaragua. And this is what I suspect we'll see in in Venezuela, Richie, and then we could see some real violence and maybe a lot of bloodshed.
There was one little bit of good news. I think we should leave the weaponization of space for another day because it's a great topic, and your article is brilliant, Stephen. I've been reading it this afternoon. Go to StephenLendman.org, folks. US militarizing space for future wars. Terrific piece again, historical piece, talking about treaties which ban outright using WMDs in space and right up to the present day, what's been going on. It's an excellent piece, Stephen. We'll leave that for another day, but just before we part company today, the populist president of Brazil, the right-wing president, which nobody seems to like outside of those who voted for him anyway, he seemed to be on board with everything Donald Trump was saying about Venezuela. But there was a little bit of light creeping through the clouds over the last few days. Didn't Bolsonaro, the Brazilian president, say that he would be absolutely opposed to the United States using Brazil for anything, whether it be for mobilizing resources, whether it be troops or whatever? So I think there's been a little bit of an about turn by Bolsonaro, which might be positive.
Oh, absolutely. He did say that. And I think the general consensus in Latin and Central America is these countries oppose military intervention in Venezuela. A lot of these countries support regime change, but they oppose military intervention. And there have been polls done in Venezuela, something like 85, maybe even 90% of Venezuelans oppose military intervention. You bet they oppose it, Richie, because there'll be bloodshed and people will be dying. This is what happens when there's military intervention. And these people aren't stupid. They know the terrible bloodshed that went on in all of U.S. war zones, and they want none of it in Venezuela.
Chavez was so close to bringing the countries of South America and Latin America and Central America together, wasn't he, before his untimely death? Stephen, I love having you on. Thanks for giving us your time today. It's StephenLendman.org, folks, Stephen, and it's at Activist Writer on Twitter. Bookmark Stephen's website, share his articles, because that sort of journalism, old school, researched, thought out, nuanced, doesn't exist anymore. Thanks for coming back, my old friend. I look forward to speaking to you again soon.
Oh, thanks so much, Richie. It really is an honor for me to come on. You are one terrific guy. We need a lot more like you.
You're too kind, mate. Thanks for that. I appreciate it. Thanks, Stephen. The brilliant Stephen Lendman, live on the line from Chicago. As I said already, Stephen Lendman, LENDMAN.org. That's the website. All these articles written daily, sourced daily, researched daily by this man on his own. And if you can help him out as well with a donation, do that. StephenLendman.org. Top man. It's 7.5 minutes to the top of the hour. A lot of tweets came in there. Let me scroll down and read a few of them. Patricia tweets, it doesn't matter how good a leader of a country is. If the United States wants the country's natural resources, oil, for example, they will do their best to bring down that leader in whatever way they can, says Patricia. Cheers for that, Patricia. In This Together tweets, how long before a terrorist group steps up in Venezuela? Well, that's Stephen's contention. Well, contention being that militants in the region could be mobilised and armed and sent into the country in the guise of freedom fighters, armed and trained and funded by the United States and others maybe, rather than you actually seeing US troops in the country. Patrick tweets, how you doing, Patrick? John Bolton claims the neocons want Venezuela's oil. Does Stephen believe that this is just a side issue with the real objective to deny socialism and democracy in the region and create more fear to feed the bloodthirsty alien elements of the cabal? Well, I think both Patricia and you are right, Patrick. It's multifaceted. Of course, control of the assets and Venezuela's oil reserves and its other mineral assets and its water, of course, and every other utility, every other state asset it has. That's very important. But of course, stopping socialism and real socialism, which most people have no idea what it means, stopping it from thriving, not only in Venezuela, but in any other country, in my opinion, is part of that agenda. I've always said that, and that's what I feel. David tweets, Russia has a red shield central bank. This is in response to Stephen talking there about the meetings in Moscow, the many meetings Some of them made public, others not made public, between Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israeli Prime Minister, who might not be Prime Minister for very long. Not that it matters. When one lunatic leaves office there is a procession of lunatics behind him ready to take his place, but he's got corruption charges pending, and, well, I don't know whether he's long for the political world. I have no idea. Keep the tweets coming in. Hi to Phil, hi to Martin Burley, hi to Nick, hi to Cartoon Drunk, who tweets, maybe the US Special Forces will be looking after him in Caracas. Presumably by him, mate, you mean Juan Guaido, the fraud who claims to be the legitimate leader of Venezuela, who arrived back in Caracas today, and Stephen Lendman told us he was greeted there by the French ambassador to the country. It is fairly disgusting, that. There's no two ways about it. How are we doing time-wise? Well, it's 4.5 minutes to the top of the hour. There is time for a tune. So here's the tune then. Now, we're going to get the headlines from FSN in a minute, and Mark Collett will join the programme then in the second hour. Loads to talk about with Mark. Knife crime in the UK, Brexit, much more besides. It's your Richie Allen Show. Thanks for joining me. Always good to be with you. News headlines next after Def Leppard. No, there's no rhyme or reason to the music played on this programme. You might hear a bit of pop, a bit of hip-hop, you might hear a bit of heavy metal, and a bit of soft rock, or hard rock. I'm not sure which it is. Def Leppard and Armageddon it on the Richie Allen Show. Straight over to FSN for some news headlines. And when we come back from the news headlines, only 30 seconds, keeping you updated on what's going on, we'll join Mark Collett for what will be a fascinating chat about, about pretty much what's been making the news today. Over to FSN then.
From Feature Story News in London, I'm Ollie Barrett. At least 23 people have been killed after a tornado struck Lee County in the US state of Alabama. The EU's regained its diplomatic status with the US after Washington downgraded the bloc's representation last year. India insists it hit terrorist camps in Pakistan during its airstrikes last week, despite Pakistan saying India hit an open area, and the UK government's launching a $2 billion fund for less prosperous towns after Brexit.
Thank you, Ollie. Ollie Barrett there at FSN. Big vaccine story broke this morning, by the way, and I've not had the time to get into it this afternoon. I'm going to try and get into it tomorrow or Wednesday, but it's a story about NHS England saying that something needs to be done about fake news around vaccines, which makes it harder to win the public argument on vaccination. This is pretty scary now. Simon Stevens said parents were seeing fake messages about vaccines and this isn't good. He talked about the World Health Organization, which says that the UK should hit a 95% target in terms of vaccinating 95% of the country's children. However, at the moment, England, I shouldn't say the UK and England, we're talking about England here. England is targeted for 95% success rate by the World Health Organization. At the moment, it's 87.5%. The money men at Big Pharma are pissed off about this, and they are exerting pressure on the government and on the NHS. They want to vaccinate your child, and the language they are using about those who wish to exempt their children from vaccination is getting all the more worrying. And it's not going to be long before vaccinating your child in this country becomes compulsory. This is one of many shots fired across the bow of independent thinkers by the NHS and by Big Pharma in recent months. It's getting serious. I want to get into that on the programme really soon. Alright? The royal family has published social media guidelines for the public, vowing to block users who leave offensive comments on royal family Twitter and Instagram and Facebook accounts. Can you believe it? Who gives a shite? That's making the news right now. I'm running through the BBC website and Sky and Channel 4 at the same time. There's another story about British... No, hang on a second now. Let's get this right. Another vaccine story which says that black, Asian and minority ethnic children are less likely to receive the HPV jab in the UK. That makes me believe that people from ethnic minority backgrounds might just be a bit more clued in about the dangers of the human papillomavirus vaccine. Gardasil is usually the product. It has caused devastation for hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands of girls in Ireland. It's the biggest cover-up in recent history in Ireland. We're learning today that ethnic minority kids in England are less likely to get the vaccine. Maybe it's because they're more clued in. I have no idea. This is the Richie Allen Show, live on richieallen.co.uk, Fab Radio 2, TuneIn Radio, and triggerwarning.tv. Always good to be with you, so it is.
The Richie Allen Show relies on your support. Go to richieallen.co.uk and set up a monthly donation today.
That's the tyranny, you see. That's what's coming down the line. Fake news about vaccines is hurting the bottom line of big pharmaceutical companies, and the big pharmaceutical companies effectively own the World Health Organization, effectively. Right? Revolving door. The WHO tells governments what to do. Governments don't argue. And it's coming down the line. It's coming down the line that you're going to be told you don't have a bloody choice. You can't exempt. To exempt is maybe to be fined. To exempt is maybe to have your children taken away and put into care. That's a very serious story, and we'll follow that as the week develops. It's exactly 5 minutes past the hour. It is the Richie Allen Show. I said that already. It's time to welcome our next guest back to the programme. Before we welcome him back to the show, it's always good to have him on. I'm looking forward to chatting with him. Story that we mentioned, or I mentioned in the monologue, in the news roundup at the very beginning, back over an hour ago. A former head of the Metropolitan Police, a man called Lord Hogan Howe, has said that a knife crime czar must be appointed in order to get a grip on the rise in youth violence. Now, a lot of people are, I think, understandably and justifiably shocked by the spate of stabbings and murders in the country in the last couple or 3 years. Two horrible stories over the weekend, a 17-year-old girl and a 17-year-old boy. The boy just down the road in Hale Barnes, murdered, stabbed, and it's been all over the news today. It's a serious story. What's going on with it? Interestingly, Trevor Phillips, an equality campaigner, wrote in the Sun newspaper last August that the media tiptoes around speaking about the ethnicity of those involved, and that it's harmful that they don't want to dig down into those demographics. I'm sure my next guest will have an opinion on that. He's a broadcaster, he's a political activist, and he's an author. His book, The Fall of Western Man, is available to read on his website, thefallofwesternman.com. I've said it before and I'll say it again. Very generous. He gives it away on there if you haven't read it and you want to read it. We've had him on before. It's good to have him back again. Let's say hello to Mark Collett. Mark, always good to have you back. How are you?
I'm great, thank you, and it's great to be back. I know we've scheduled a few shows over the past few months, but every one of them seems to have been scuppered by illness or some other tragedy.
That's right, and I thought to myself, he thinks now that there's some reason I'm not honouring these commitments and maybe I don't want to have you back. But of course, that's a nonsense. I'm very interested in what you have to say. I like listening to you. Whether I agree or don't is absolutely irrelevant. My audience wants to hear opinions. Dare I use the diverse word? Dare I say diverse? My audience wants to hear people who think differently than I do. Otherwise, it's the most boring program in the world. And I like you. I want to talk about. I mean, you can weigh in any time and change the subject because we've got most of the hour if you wanted, Mark. But let's talk about the stabbings. It's not the sort of crime that I would often kind of dig down into, but there's been such a spate of it in the capital, in Birmingham. We've seen it in the Northwest, of course, over the weekend. What do you make of the Metropolitan Police saying, and Cressida Dick, who is the current head of the Metropolitan Police, agreeing that there needs to be a knife crime czar? Is that going to do any good? Is that going to help them get a grip on the problem?
No, of course it's not. I mean, I'm just waiting for them to suggest that we should all have our cutlery taken away and that there should be a cutlery amnesty and we should all eat off plastic knives and forks, because that's the true solution. That's going to be, and I know that I'm saying that jokingly, but it is coming to that. I mean, I actually know a girl who works in a department store, and she told me that the police did a sting where they sent a young couple in to buy a wooden chopping board, a pizza cutter, and some cutlery. And then when that was sold to them, the police swooped on the store to prove a point that cutlery was being sold to these teenagers. Now, that's how ridiculous things have got. As if there is no agency whatsoever. As if people can't say, well, look, this is a young couple coming in and buying a chopping board, a pizza cutter, and some cutlery. Let's have this as a sting, because they're just the kind of people who are going to go out on a stabbing rampage. But in politically correct Britain, that's a legitimate police sting. Now, in reality, we know who's behind this. We know what's driving knife crime. We know this is about demographic change. We know that mass immigration's brought this here because we're importing people from places in the world where chopping people up with a machete is something that's done on a regular basis, where that's a regular punishment. I mean, you don't have to dig very far onto places like YouTube or other video sharing sites to see people, have their fingers chopped off, their hands chopped off, attacked in this brutal manner. And that's daily life in some parts of the world. And if you import people from those parts of the world, you don't just bring the people, you bring the culture and you bring the problems.
Trevor Phillips, I mentioned him in the introduction. I agree with some of that. I mean, I've seen some of these horrible videos, but you get it in Latin America with the Zetas. You get it in a lot of places where there is drug crime. But I want to just read what Trevor Phillips said, because he's an equality campaigner. Correct me if I'm wrong, Mark. He might have one time been the Equality Commissioner. I'm not sure. Maybe I'm wrong. But Trevor Phillips...
No, he was the head of the Equalities Commission for quite a while, yes.
Cheers, mate. I thought I might have been wrong on that. Now, he said the media scrupulously avoids mentioning ethnicity. I understand the fear of stigmatising these groups, but nothing could be more relevant. Race is part of the picture, and failing to point it out impedes the fight against these crimes and puts more children in danger. And he's kind of some way or somehow or somewhat echoing what you said in a way right now. But Cressida Dick said that it's about drugs, that ultimately there is a drug war on to supply middle-class parties with drugs. Now, before I let you back in and I shut up, I found it very interesting recently. I was speaking to somebody who came around to my house for a couple of drinks and some food, and that person likes to take a certain Class B, or is it a Class A drug? I don't know. It's powder anyway, occasionally. All right, it's cocaine. I've never taken anything in my life. Honest to God, I never have. But I had a guest recently who dabbles in that every now and then, and said that, well, it's really a middle income thing now. It's everywhere. Everybody, Richie, in the city, working in the city, they're all taking it. And there is a massive competition. There is a huge problem among those who want to supply that. That's where all the murdering starts. So on the one hand, maybe Cressida Dick is saying, well, it's not really race, but Trevor Phillips is saying it is.
Well, I'm inclined to believe Trevor Phillips, and I'm inclined to believe him because his political development was very, very interesting. He was head of the Equalities Commission. He monitored these things for years, and he was told, you're the guy who's pulling it all together. But really, he wasn't there to pull it all together. He was there to tell the government what they wanted to hear, that everyone was getting okay, getting on wonderfully, and people were coming here because they were great people and they were going to enrich us. And the only people ruining it all were these horrible white people who, can't accept all this diversity. But at the end of his tenure, Trevor Phillips made, I can't remember the name of the show, I believe it was on Channel 4 though, he made a number of explosive documentaries on Channel 4, I think they're part of a series actually, where he exposed certain communities for not fitting in and for actually being very much the opposite of the kind of people you'd want in the UK. And it was very interesting to see him do that. It was almost like watching a man who'd been sent in and told what the conclusion was, not told to find a conclusion, not told to investigate, but told what the conclusion was. But then over time, realizing that actually the conclusion he was told to find was the opposite of the truth. And ever since then, he has been very, very honest about what he feels are the causes of these problems. And it doesn't surprise me, though, that white liberals will say the exact opposite of that white liberals will make out that in fact it's something else. And of course, this is all the middle class whites' fault, who obviously now, we're going to be told are up to their neck in cocaine, like, Tony Montana at the end of Scarface. Whereas in fact, the real problem here is the attitudes of those coming into the UK and what they believe is a culturally acceptable way to solve a problem or to solve an argument. And you've got to remember that when you read into some of these stories, and it wasn't too long ago, and you can Google this anyone who doesn't believe me, Google this. It wasn't too long ago that Cressida Dick was saying that it wasn't anything to do with cocaine or drugs. It was to do with YouTube, and YouTube not shutting down rap videos that had violent lyrics.
Oh yeah, the music, yeah. Look, on this idea about Somalians and Ethiopians and Central Africans, I'm not a white liberal, and I'm not, and I love a good chat and I love a good argument. I certainly don't try and virtue signal. But look, I live in Fallowfield in Manchester. I'm just around the corner from Moss Side and Princess Road, and there are many Somalians and Ethiopians. I don't know any of them personally, I'm not going to lie, but I know they're there. And they don't go around chopping people up. And also, they don't, as part of their culture, believe that it's okay to chop people up. And I want to say something else, Mark. I know from experience, in terms of investigating and looking into it, that in North America, biker gangs that run certain drugs businesses are equally as violent and vicious in terms of chopping up bodies and dismembering people to send out messages. So I don't think that sort of behaviour can be easily claimed to be kind of unique to Somalians, Ethiopians and Central Africans. Do you want to take the first point first with, over on Moss Side, you got these Somalians, in fact, since Moss Side became, dare I say, diverse, but since you have more Somalians and Ethiopians in there, there's been much less violence in that part of Manchester. Do you want to take that point first?
Well, I would say that I don't know the exact crime statistics in Manchester. I certainly wouldn't want to live in Moss Side. I certainly wouldn't want to live in any part of the country which has become an immigrant ghetto. And I would say that the places these people take over do become ghettos. They become places where white people feel very, very uneasy. And the very dishonest whites will flee from these places and go to nice leafy glades, but almost have some amnesia as to why they did flee, which I find very disingenuous. And on your second point, yes, there are sort of unwelcome elements within every racial group, within every community, within every ethnicity. But what I would say is the prevalence of those sort of less savoury, how can I say it in a way that I won't get prosecuted?
Characteristics. I know what you're saying. You think it might insert. You think in certain ethnic groups, you think some groups might be more predisposed than others. That's what you think.
Exactly. The unsavoury elements make up a higher percentage of certain communities than others. And I would say if you look at places in the Middle East or in Africa, and you look at the way they live, they look at the way they treat each other, they look at the way they treat women, and you look at their general attitudes, I don't think they are good attitudes. I don't think they're attitudes that gel well with Western attitudes or European attitudes. And I think, but then again, it's not really for me to say that. If they're in their own countries, they can do what they wish. And I certainly wouldn't want to impose my values on them. Yeah. I just don't want them really coming here, and I don't want them bringing their attitudes with them. I think Britain is better off as an overwhelmingly homogenous white country.
You know that some of that I don't agree with, but I also don't believe and I won't tolerate somebody calling you a racist, because it's not. I think it's too simplistic, and I know you've had to deal with this your entire career. People screaming racist at you. I'm not patronising it, but I don't believe that you are. Look, I don't believe that certain cultures or certain ethnic groups are more predisposed to negative characteristics than others. I don't believe that. But again, it's not because I'm a white liberal. I've been lucky enough to travel a lot over the years, and I'm not talking about silly package holidays. I've been all over the world. I've been in Central America. I've been in North Africa. And what I see in those countries, particularly poor countries, is warm, generous, decent people, generally religious people, whether it's Islam, whether it's Catholicism or whatever. But what I do agree with you saying is, and I'll be called racist for saying it, but I agree with it. Look, I live in Fallowfield. In my neighbourhood, there are a lot of Sikhs and Indians and Pakistanis living in our area, but I just don't care. Not because I'm a white liberal, I just don't care. But I do understand why some people who've lived in a place all their lives, suddenly find themselves, to use the word surrounded. Some people will say it's a weaponized word. I don't mean surrounded, but all of a sudden they become the minority in their community. I do have sympathy with people questioning that and asking questions, and the liberal press and the government, successive governments, both parties, want to shut people down and dismiss their fears and their concerns by calling them little Englanders or racists, and that's short-sighted and it is bullshit. I don't believe you're racist at all. I believe in what you believe about some cultures being more predisposed to bad stuff than others isn't racist. It's what you believe, and I know you believe it passionately. What are we going to do about it, Mark? Because
I have an interesting solution.
Go on, here's the solution. This is the question, the solution.
These politicians, these white liberal politicians, they're overwhelmingly white liberal, or from another ethnicity that you can never ever question. I think if we've got these people, they're on 77. Actually, they're not in 77 grand a year, because I hear they've just voted themselves another £2,000 a year pay rise, so their basic income is now 79,000. That's really nice, though, isn't it, Richie? I mean, I wish I was in a position where every year I could vote myself a £2,000 a year pay rise. They're living in these lovely affluent areas, in these houses. They're protected by the Secret Service. They're looked after, and not only do they get all this money, but they get all these expenses, and companies and businesses are very, very eager to help them out with freebies and other things. So when you take it all into account, of their £79,000 a year that they voted themselves, they don't really have to spend that much of it, because there's all the extras and the second home allowances and all the other stuff that they get. So why don't we get these people, and why don't we strip them of their wealth, and why don't we, just as an experiment, and why don't we drop them in some of these enriched areas that they claim to love? Because I love to see someone like Margaret Hodge tottering around the Sink estate, embarking in a Jimmy Choos. It's always very endearing. But why don't we actually strip her of these things, put her on a basic income, and see how she lasts there for 2 months? Let's see if these out of touch liberal politicians living in their ivory towers, why don't they want to come out of those ivory towers and live amongst the diversity they created? And that's really how I gauge these things, because these people, if they genuinely believed in what they've created, they'd want to immerse themselves in it. Because I've made many comments in the past that I've been, pulled up on for a certain period of history that I'd have liked to have lived in. And if I had a time machine, I'd make good on my promise, which I don't. But these people have created a reality that they could quite clearly and easily go and live in tomorrow, that they tell us that we should love living in. Well, if we should love it so much, why don't they come and join us?
We've had a few comments on this on Twitter. You'll be able to see them yourself anyway. In This Together says, well, he sounds like a racist to me, Richie. His prejudice isn't backed up by any evidence. Presumably, he's referring to your belief, which I don't share, that some cultures are more predisposed to certain types of negative social behaviours than others. Now, look, I know you'll say that you've written the book, and I'm happy to mention the book and recommend that people read it. I found it very interesting. I did read it, of course. I'm not a hypocrite. I read it, and there's some very interesting thoughts in there, some very interesting theories in there. And by interesting, again, I'm not patronising Mark. A lot of food for thought in there. thefallofwesternman.com. Buy a copy of it if you can afford to, if you want to read it. He's generously, has Mark, put it on there as a free ebook download. With Facebook pages being deleted from people, and I've got to reiterate this, my personal feelings for Tommy Robinson are well known. I interviewed the man many years ago several times on a talk radio show in Spain. I don't believe he's genuine. There are a lot of negative things I could say about him, but I would never endorse anybody's Facebook page being shut down, their videos being deleted, or PayPal saying we will get in the way of a private transaction between somebody who wants to support you and you. I would never agree with that. You either agree with free speech full stop or you don't. There are no caveats. And the people whom I most vehemently disagree with, and you're not one, by the way, a lot of things I don't agree with about you, but not vehemently, you stand up for their right to say it without being demonised, without being harassed, without being doxed, which is disgusting. I'm only learning about doxing, Mark. I didn't know anything about that because I'm really ignorant when it comes to computers. But I'm learning that people with certain opinions who've had the courage to speak about their opinions under their own name are having their places of work contacted and their families contacted, threatening them because they said, well, this is how I feel. A word on the censorship. I know we talked about this every other time, but it seems that each time you get back to come on the programme, it seems to have progressed a bit further. What do you think?
It certainly has. And the thing with Tommy Robinson, whether people like him or whether they don't, he is a remarkably brave and tenacious person who is willing to go to jail for his beliefs. And he has been censored by one of these mega corporations that has so much money and so much power that it can twist what its members, and it has billions of members, can twist what they see, what they hear, what they're exposed to. And it is doing so for a political agenda. And when you look at that, it's very scary. And then you've got people like Tom Watson from the Labour Party, an utterly disgusting man, might I add, who is writing to YouTube and saying, and I'm going to translate this into the simplest possible terms. He's writing to YouTube and saying, I am a politician. I would like you, YouTube, a huge global corporation, to remove my political adversaries from your platform because I don't agree with them. Thank you. Good night.
Yeah, it's outrageous.
How disgusting is that?
Yeah, it's outrageous. It's gone beyond the pale. As I was recovering from pneumonia a couple of weeks ago, I didn't miss it, that the government has basically said to YouTube and to Facebook, if you don't more expeditiously take down that which we have declared to be fake news, we're going to fine the trousers off you. That must terrify everybody. Governments, can you imagine it? People that are supposed to be held to account by people like us, being governments telling these social media giants, when we tell you to get rid of something, you get rid of it or we'll fine the trousers off you. Sure, it's the very definition of fascism, Mark.
Well, actually, I'd say it's more communism. I'd say this is exactly what you would have in a communist state. And when you look at the way the law is written, and I have produced some very extensive pieces on this, we now have a law which is not defined by the police, it is not defined by the government, it is defined by the interpretation of the person reporting the alleged crime. So if the police, if you believe something is a hate crime, if you see a white woman walking down the street and she crosses the road because she sees a black man coming the other way, or there's a black man coming the other way, and she crosses the street, and you ring up the police and say, I saw this woman cross the road and there was a black man walking the other way, and I believe that was motivated by hate, the police legally have to log that as a hate incident. And she, as the person reporting that, cannot be questioned or challenged. If it is their belief, it has to be logged. Now, there was actually a case where an elderly white woman was arrested and questioned because somebody saw her beep at a black motorist, and the person reporting the incident believed it to be motivated by hate. This is just like living in the Soviet Union, but instead of speaking out against the political establishment, instead of speaking out against the Communist Party, which is what would have got you dragged away had it been reported, now if you speak out against diversity, against political correctness, or against any one of these groups which are deemed to be absolutely holy to the state, so immigrants, transgenders, homosexuals, if you speak out in any way against any of those or their activities, you can be dragged away on the say-so of an individual without any evidence.
Yes, and I think, again, when I was recovering, I think a young woman was kept in a police station for 7 hours because she said to somebody in a heated argument on Twitter, no matter what you say, you'll never be a woman. I will always see you as a man. She might have put it a bit more aggressively than that. Who cares? It's her opinion. And she was arrested and put in a prison cell for 7 hours before being allowed to go home. I can't believe that the Independent Police Complaints Commission, if there is such a thing here, isn't looking into the conduct of the officers who dealt with that. That is truly scary. I'm going to argue with you, by the way, over communism and fascism. It's absolutely fascism when the government is taking over the media, and you have media in collusion with government to shut down debate and criticism. And I mean, you're getting it all the time now with certain Labour MPs, not necessarily the Jewish ones, but certain feminist Labour MPs, your Stella Creasy's and others, saying that, you know, people are going to have to be banned and kicked off Twitter. There's going to have to be investigations into finding out who these people are just because they maybe scream an insult during a debate on Twitter, instead of just blocking the person or muting them like cowardly cretins like Owen Jones would do. You know, if you're that annoyed by what someone is saying, just block them. These are crazy times, Mark. Crazy times. Here's a question for you on the whole thing about immigrants, right? Do you not? I'm going to say something to you now. I've listened to you quite a bit. I've read your book and I've listened to you do your own program, which we'll give a big plug to in a minute. It goes out on Wednesday, isn't that right? It is Wednesday.
Wednesday at 7 o'clock UK time.
Wednesday at 7 o'clock UK time. I asked my listeners, particularly those listeners who maybe don't go along with Mark, or maybe their thinking sits on the left of the spectrum, have a listen to him, because it's really interesting, thought-provoking stuff. You know, it's cerebral stuff, whether you agree with it or not. So anyway, look, what I can't understand is, especially, I find you incredibly smart. You're a very, very, very smart guy. Why hasn't somebody like you done more? And I know you can tell me to fuck off if you want and say, well, why should I do more, Richie? But why haven't you done more to talk to third, fourth, fifth generation immigrants? You know, Sikhs, Pakistanis, Indians, even Africans, to talk about these issues and to say, look, this is what's gone on. There's an agenda behind it. You know, it's not necessarily your agenda, but this is what has happened. I think by doing that, maybe you would avoid a lot of the cheap shots that you get from the liberal media. Or maybe you'll tell me now, well, I don't care about the liberal media, Richie. I just do it the way I do it. Do you understand the question and the motivation behind my question? Because I mean it sincerely. Go ahead.
Well, firstly, I don't care about the liberal media, but secondly, it was only the other week we had Jesse Lee Peterson on from the United States. Jesse Lee Peterson is I'd consider him a good friend of mine. I've been on his show. He's a really entertaining guy. He's a black guy, an African American. He's a Christian. He talks about his wish to preserve white nations, because he believes that white nations with overwhelming majorities of white people do good for the world, and he thinks that, like me, that pushing people together and doing something that will eventually cause the white race to slowly become a minority, slowly become extinct, this demographic change, he believes is a bad thing. I believe it's a bad thing. He's a black man who believes the same as me. I shake his hand. I call him a friend. He comes on my show. I go on his show.
He's a conservative, though, Mark. Sorry to interrupt you. He's a conservative and he's a Christian. And I'd expect you to have a bit in common with him. But what about somebody from Somalia or somebody from Nigeria who's living here and maybe has lived here for years? Or maybe somebody from, you know, an Afro-Caribbean background. The point I'm making is, I struggle to find the words to explain what I mean here. I know that you mean well. And again, that's not to patronise you, because I'm not saying that I'm right and you're wrong. I would never do that. Everything is subjective. I know that you mean well. But I think there would be a lot of people who come from minority backgrounds who might be interested in hearing what you have to say and the issues around these things. But they might be put off by the whole thing of, well, you know, the white race has been eliminated and all of that. And some of these communities are saying, well, we haven't done any of that. We've lived here for years and years. We came here in the 50s, came here in the 60s to do jobs that were there. We put families down here. We're law-abiding and we get involved in the community. Who's he talking about? Is he talking about us? That's the point I'm kind of trying to make. I think you're
I've
much
made many videos explaining my point on this. I've even said repeatedly the Jewish role in mass immigration into Europe. I did a video on that. I did a video on wars for Israel drive mass migration into Europe. Just the other week I did a video how the Israel lobby controls America. I am constantly making it very clear that the people that get my anger are the globalists, are people who are pushing multiculturalism. And I don't think I've ever come out, ever, and simply attacked migrant communities. In fact, all of my points over the last 4, 5, 6, 7 years have been very, very consistent in the fact that I believe people are coming here for a better life. I believe they're coming here for economic reasons, and they're coming here because the door has been opened. And if you have an issue where wolves are coming into the barn to eat the sheep, what do you do? Do you get mad at the sheep? Do you get mad at the wolves? Or do you get mad at the boy that's opening the barn door?
So weaponized migration, we did speak about this before, and you're smart enough to know how that has happened, the destruction of the Middle East effectively, and all the rest of it. And yet, and I don't know, because I think you're too smart not to know that you're doing it. Because I have seen those videos, and you asked some very good questions about the Zionist influence in the UK and in the United States. The neocon Zionist alliance, which I talk about a lot, it's not just Israel, of course, it's the governments of Saudi Arabia, of France, of the UK. You know, there's no two ways about that. And yet you'll say something like you said earlier on. And again, you know, I'm not the moral authority on any of this. I'm not saying that I'm right and you're wrong. And yet you'll say that you think that some of these people are more predisposed to having the more kind of evil gene. But that's, you know, I don't agree with that, which, you know, fair enough.
I think there are IQ differences, and I think people react to situations in a very different way. I think people from advanced Western civilizations, or people, for example, I think people from Japan, if they migrated here in large numbers, would not create the kind of problems you'd see if you brought people over here from, say, Uganda or Somalia. I think they would be far more able to mix within Western society than people from sub-Saharan Africa.
You're not going to like this, my friend. I must say this, by the way, because I've got to remind our listeners, mea culpa. Mark Collett is on the line. I always like speaking with Mark. I look forward to having him on the programme. The Fall of Western Man.com is Mark's book. I think you're very wrong about this IQ thing. I think in recent decades, the white man's dependence on technology, the white man's diet, the white man's addiction to television, to sports, to cell phones, to tablets has dumbed us down to the point, and I've travelled in North Africa, I see the opposite. I see people in the so-called third world much more alert, much more bright, and much more capable of solving problems. And again, I'm not trying to be some sort of virtue signal here. I'm no Stacey Dooley holding up black babies or anything like that. I'm not, Mark. I'm honest. I think our IQs are on the wane because of the things I just described, the technology, everything else, the laziness, the food. And I think in third world, in sub-Saharan world, I think people are far more clever and they're quicker to figure things out than we are. That's my belief. Back to you.
Well, I don't believe that one for 1 minute, but what I do believe is there is a diseugenic plot against people in places like the UK. If you look at childcare costs in the UK, it is absolutely prohibitive for middle-class couples who want to have children and the woman is constantly forced back into work. Childcare costs can be £1,100 a month or more. For a woman who takes home £1,500 a month, she is working a full-time job to bring home £400 a month when childcare is being paid for. This is being done in a diseugenic manner to ensure that the best people within our society do not have babies. Yet, if you look at the lower stratas on sink estates, they are essentially being paid to breed. This is the exact opposite of evolution. This is devolution of our people. And this is something that has been planned, and it is being carried out in a meticulous way to ensure a drop in our IQ and a drop in the quality of our people. Couple that with the fact that people are now praying at the temple, the altar of hedonism and materialism, where they don't think they should have to have any consequences for their action. You couple that with abortion, you couple that with the fact that people think a career is something that's going to fulfill them, and you've got a fact where white people aren't having children anymore, and the best white people are having even less than the worst. So you take all that into account, you look at the the UN definition of genocide, bringing about a condition where a group of people are in decline. People have brought about the condition where we are in decline. That, my friend, is white genocide.
When people hear you talk about genetics and the worst people having more children and that, it scares some people, Mark.
Well, the truth scares lots of people, my friend. The truth scares a lot of people.
Not about the fact that you alleged, but the fact that you're saying it. Now, again, you're not on a liberal show. You're not on with a virtue signaler. I am not. But some people think, Christ, that sounds very much like stuff that was being said in the 1930s.
Well, if people in the 1930s were telling the truth, I'm telling the truth now. And if people want to call me whatever they want to call me, it's like water off a duck's back. I will speak the truth, even if I speak it alone and I'm completely isolated for doing so. Because the fact is, being truthful isn't always popular.
No.
And I've got used to being unpopular.
Well,
and to be honest, I take it as a badge of honour.
Yeah, and to be fair, it's not a correction, but it's your opinion. I know you feel it's your educated opinion, and I'm not going to live in a world where people don't speak to people they disagree with. But worse than that, they try to label people and have them shut down and destroyed because they disagree with them. I wasn't being underhanded or smart or smug by saying there are people who would say this eugenic stuff is scary, because it is true, it is scary. It doesn't scare me, you saying it. I know you believe it. I don't agree with it. I stand by what I say about travelling in poorer areas. I only meet very smart people, problem-solving people, cute people. I really mean that. Again, I have to, because I know you bring a lot of listeners with you, because you've got a big audience, and some of them will be listening now going, what a wanker this guy Alan is. He's really, no, I'm not, I've never been a virtue signaler. Listen to the show, listen to some of the things I say and I own up to believing. Not at all. But I just don't buy into this, that there's an IQ difference. An old friend of yours, David Duke, I had this out with him on a show about 3 years ago. It went on and on, back and forwards for about a half an hour. It's just not something I agree with, but you're entitled to your opinion. And again, I'm not patronising.
If you look at just look at the evidence. You look at people who created this wonderful European civilization, and you look at people who created something that is de facto not as good. And there is a difference between those people. But that's not to say
there's nothing wonderful about living in Europe. This wonderful European civilization has seen Greece, Italy, Spain, the Republic of Ireland destroyed. As money rolls uphill to financial elite banks, central banks, and state assets are robbed, and people are living in absolute poverty. Ireland is having an immigration crisis like it had in the days of the so-called famine. There's nothing wonderful about European civilization, in my opinion. Over to you.
No, look, I'm not saying that, because I think that what we have created as a civilization is better. I'm not saying that means that white people are de facto better 100%. There is something absolutely beautiful about a tribe of people who live within their own boundaries, respect nature, do not destroy their environments, and have lived that way for hundreds, if not thousands of years, defending, promoting and propagating their own culture. I don't look down at these people. I just see them as different. But I see the man who created St. Paul's Cathedral as slightly differently to the men living that way in a jungle, in a very, what may be described as primitive, but in a very real way is closer to nature. I just see them as different. And I don't believe that pushing people who are that different together into the same habitat habitat and asking them to behave in the same way is good for anyone. And I don't really see that as a particularly controversial point, but it has been made controversial by those who wish to destroy those of European descent.
I don't disagree with your point, and we've had this chat before about pushing people together and the problems it causes. I've always believed it was weaponized to divide and conquer people, so that people, rather than get together regardless of race, colour or creed and focus your attention on the real evil agenda, we end up killing one another on identity politics things. I've always believed that. Again, Rosa Petal says, Mark, you're not alone. Bravo for speaking the truth there. Thanks for that, Rosa. Appreciate that. And there was another comment there from Davo Pamsky, who says, Richie, you might not like to hear it, but Mark is talking sense. I do like to hear it. I like to hear people, intelligent people coming on the programme that I disagree with, or whom disagree with me. Of course I do. Otherwise the programme is monotonously boring. Delroy, who is black. How you doing, Delroy? Your guest makes interesting points, Richie. I believe he is wrong, but not very wrong. His cultural bias is nauseating to me, and I could call him out on a lot of what he says. But Delroy said, not very wrong. Cultural bias, I don't know. I believe that Mark is sincere in what he's saying, and I read the book, and there's some very good points in there. And I think we ultimately agree in terms of the agenda behind it. And that's what's a bit strange, really. William tweets, bad people come in all shapes and sizes and all kinds of colours. The Fall of Western Man.com is the book. In about 5 or 6 minutes, we're going to run out of time, so I've got to ask you this. I think one thing we were agreed on from day one, Brexit was never going to be allowed to happen, was it?
It certainly wasn't, and what a farce it's become. And do you know the greatest thing about Brexit? The greatest thing is all of these people, all these clowns who say that we need to rerun the vote, they keep calling it a people's vote. They keep saying, well, I think we need a people's vote, as if the first one wasn't a people's vote. But the best thing is all these MPs who are, or a lot of these MPs who are calling for this so-called people's vote, have just betrayed their own parties, betrayed the voters who voted for them, and have decided to become independents. And I would like to ask the Luciana Bergers and the Anna Soubries why their constituents aren't getting a people's vote on whether they should continue as MPs now they have walked away from the party that they were elected to represent.
It's amazing that so many of these Labour MPs actually represent constituencies where the result was overwhelmingly to leave because of what unskilled and semi-skilled migration did to working class communities. That's why so many Labour voters, particularly in the north of the country, Mark, I don't have to tell you this, you know this yourself. That's why so many of them, of course, voted to leave, not because they had a problem with various ethnicities or whatever, but they knew, and I've always said this, trade unionists of the 1970s and 1980s traditionally were very much against open door migration for these very reasons. But will people learn, Mark? Will the men and women of these constituencies, will they finally wake up to who rules them and who's really in charge, or will they just go back to sleep after this?
They'll go back to sleep. The fact is, democracy doesn't work. I've done a video on it, actually. Go and watch it, anyone who wants to, say why democracy doesn't work. Because the problem is, the main parties have created this two-party system, which is a complete false dichotomy, where people don't vote for the party they want to win. They vote for the party that they dislike the least and think has the greatest chance of defeating the party they dislike the most. And when you get into that kind of unhealthy situation, politics is completely wrecked. And that's why the entire political establishment needs sweeping away, and we need to change the way things are run, where people are voted for on a proportional representation system, forcing allegiances, forcing genuine politics to emerge from that. Because, I mean, you know, I used to be part of the BNP. Well, we got enough votes for something like 60 MPs, but we never had 60 MPs. Why didn't we have 60 MPs? Because we have this first past the post system. Now, if we had a direct proportional representation system, if people want to vote for the monster raving loony party and they get enough votes across the nation for 2 MPs, those people should rightfully be represented. But at the moment, there are a huge number of people who are either tied into this horrible voting system or just drop out because they realise their vote doesn't count. That's not democracy. That's a sham.
Yes, but I hate to burst your bubble. As an Irishman, proportional representation hasn't done anything for us. Our country has never been as corrupt or as bent or as filthy or as sleazy. It is now as it ever was, and the same parties get returned, the same old gangsters every 5 years over there, Mark. I ultimately believe, I think I said this to you before, the whole system has to come down. Because unless you take money out of it, and they'll never do that, you're always going to get candidates that are beholden to those who have paid for them. That's my opinion. I'm going to give you the final word on that. Before I do...
I'll give you the final word.
Go on.
We're not going to disagree on that, Richie.
No.
It's nice to end the show on something we can shake hands on and agree 100% on. The way to change things is to tear it down and start again.
Tear it all down. thefallofwesternman.com. If you want to dig deeper into Mark's thinking, his theories, his ideology, I've read the book. Saying that I found it interesting is not patronising it. It's a good read. You might shake your fist at parts of it. You might say, wow, yeah, I can buy into that. It's good. Challenge yourself, particularly if you don't agree. Read it. It's the only way we're going to learn and grow. Talk to people whose opinions differ from ours. Thanks for coming back. You know you're always welcome back. thefallofwesternman.com. Mark Collett, cheers, mate. Great to have you back on again.
Thank you very much.
And Mark will be back on again in the near future, no doubt. Cheers, Mark. I appreciate that. It's coming up for 10 minutes to the top of the hour. A lot of comments came in there. Craig Moffat tweets, brilliant show. Mark is spot on, says Craig. Thanks for that there. Quite a mix there. Paul tweets, that remark about IQ sounds like a racist generalisation. Does he mean educated? If people are living in an oppressed country, they're not going to meet any kind of measurable quota. Well, that's why I fundamentally disagree with Mark on that point. That, you know, Western educated and Western born folks have higher IQs than those in other parts of the world. To me, it's demonstrably easy to prove. It's easy to prove that that's wrong. It's a nonsense. What do you measure IQ by? Is it to build all these infrastructures and all these massive big buildings? These big progressive, forward-thinking, scientific kind of superstructure cities. I wouldn't argue, or I wouldn't agree that is somehow demonstrative of a society that's full of very smart people, because the architecture is lovely. Not at all. Again, as I said, I've been lucky enough to travel around the world, Central America, North Africa briefly, but I was there, Spain, other parts of the world, North America. To me, in third world countries, the ones I've visited anyway, I genuinely believe that the indigenous populations of those countries, some black, some Arabic, to me seemed to be brighter, to be sharper, to be more, to be more, what's the word I'm looking at? To be more communicative, easier socially, more clever in terms of dealing with people socially, than people in my own country and the countries I've lived in. That's not virtue signalling. Please, it isn't. It really isn't. That's what I really believe. I had this out with Duke 3 years ago, got pretty spiteful, the conversation. To me, it's just monumental bollocks that black people in sub-Saharan Africa are not as bright as people in the UK. Absolute nonsense, in my opinion. But Mark believes it, and he's entitled to believe it. And those who have tweeted to say that they think that it's evidence of racism, well, you're entitled to believe that as well. And that's fair enough. So there you are. Lots of comments on that. To see what people are tweeting me, go to twitter.com and it's at Richie Allen Show on Twitter. At Richie Allen Show on Twitter. Rich, Mr. Mortimer tweets, regarding Brexit, we can't leave, Richie. It would mean Frexit, Spexit, iTexit, Grexit, etc., etc., etc. Thanks, Rich. The point being, I suppose, that if the UK comes out properly with no deal and then the UK thrives, well, then other countries would want to follow suit. I tend to agree with that. Moinga tweets, Richie, I believe the most intelligent people in the UK are two Nigerians, twins, Paula and Peter. Thanks, Moinga. Are those children part of that show about very clever children? Is that right? Peter and Paula. I don't watch much entertainment television, Moinga, but I've heard Radio 5 Live breakfast presenters talking about Britain's smartest children. Is that right? And the smartest kids are Paula and Peter from Nigeria. Is that right? Good stuff. I like it. In This Together tweets, man, though he was the most intelligent because he built roads, cities, bridges, etc., while all dolphins did was splash about having a laugh, dolphins thought they were the most intelligent for exactly the same reason. Richie. Yeah. Cheers, mate. Thanks for that. Appreciate that. Thanks, Rich. Delroy tweets, white people in Manchester aren't as bright as white people in London. And he puts a smiley face after that. I don't know. I take the Pepsi challenge, even though I'm not from England. I'm Irish, obviously. But I take the Pepsi challenge with anybody from anywhere. Whether you're black, white, whether you're Arabic, whether you're Asian, I'll take the Pepsi challenge. I'll have a game of Trivial Pursuit with you any day of the week. Although general knowledge and intelligence are two different things. Intelligence has got nothing to do with regurgitating somebody else's ideas on an exam paper for your university degree. And I know all about that, you see, having gone through it twice. It's a load of bollocks. Real intelligence is being able to get along. Real intelligence is to live with somebody, to love them, to take them for their good points and their bad points, to bring a child into the world, to nurture the child, to care for him or her, to look after him. That's real intelligence as far as I'm concerned. You know, mathematics, Rachel Riley being able to do long division and to do multiplication is obviously no sign of real intelligence, because Rachel Riley is as thick as fucking pig shit, judging by her tweets about anti-Semitism. There are more brains in Stacey Dooley's tits than Rachel Riley has, right? Right. I've been building up to that all day. The woman can do extraordinarily quick mathematical multiplications and divisions. She's not got a brain in her head, though. She was trained to do that, presumably, at the university she went to, in my opinion. Anyway, that's it. I'm doomed. I'll forever be associated with that quote about Riley and Stacey Dooley. Right, I'm going to love you and leave you. Amongst the guests tomorrow will be Dr. Stuart Waiton, PhD, who left us down, remember, last Thursday. He's a good guy. He got caught up in meetings at his university. He will be with me tomorrow when we're going to talk about a lot of things. That's all I'm telling you. I will have another guest as well. Later on in the week, Paul Craig Roberts returns to the programme. It's building up to be a pretty interesting week, I think, all around. Sincere thanks again to Mark Collett. Thanks, Mark. And to Stephen Lendman. Mark's website is thefallofwesternman.com. To read more about Stephen Lendman and his articles, go to stephenlendman.org. That's stephenlendman.org. I've been Richie Allen. You've been listening. Thank you. Very Alan Partridge of me there. Back tomorrow at 5 with Europe's most listened to independent radio show, Your Richie Allen. Look after yourselves and one another. Until tomorrow then, enjoy Monday evening. Bye.